I'm here with the Sacramento History Museum. We're going to start our Museum Monday in just a few seconds. We want to let people get on, and we also want to check that our audio is working. We have had some issues with, there was an update on Facebook, and it's not compatible with our microphones. So I will be yelling at the camera right now, picking up the audio. So we're going to wait just a few seconds here at the camp to see if the audio is working before we get going. And we miss out on the first 2 minutes of my presentation. Would be no good.
Sounds good.
Good. All right. Okay, well, hi everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Museum Monday, where we are discussing the rivers. It's still River Month. Today we're going to be talking about kind of man versus nature and battling nature and why the rivers in Sacramento look the way that they do now. So behind me here, we're just a few steps away from our history museum. We're very lucky, I feel like, as a staff that we get to come here and watch the river on a kind of day-to-day basis and see just how it changes. Behind me is the Sacramento River, and I think it's really important to know that there's always been a constant in Sacramento, that buildings come and go and roads change, people change, but the river has always been a constant, and it's meant a lot of different things to a lot of people who have lived in Sacramento. If we could go back in time, we like to do a little project or activity with kids when they come to visit, and we try and get them into the mindset of what life would have been like a long time ago. And it's hard sometimes to imagine what life would be like without all the highways we have or the cars and whatnot. So sometimes we think about what wouldn't have been here, so we can kind of take away the buildings and whatnot. But it's almost easier then to also say, well, what is here? And the river is our constant. The river has always been here. And the people have used it in different ways. It's been for a food source, it's transportation. It's a pathway that, can often mean life. Everybody needs water. So if we could travel back 5,000 years, the Native Americans in this area have used the river for a lot of different ways that we don't use necessarily today. And we also know that Native Americans who lived in this area did not live on the banks of this river, at least not in the winter months, because they knew that this river flooded, and so they knew not to live here and have to rebuild every time. Even some of the earliest people who came here and made Sacramento home, like for example John Sutter, the story goes that he arrived here, and in this area where I am currently standing, it used to be the confluence of the Sacramento and the American rivers. And that has changed. We're going to talk about that. But when John Sutter arrived here, it was still the confluence. And so he arrived, and the story goes that he came here, came upon the banks, looked around, and saw that there were branches in the tops of the trees, and realized, oh, this area must flood a lot. This would not be a very good place to build things because it's going to flood. And that's why Sutter's Fort is about 2.5 miles away from here on actually kind of a raised area. So it's further inland to kind of prevent the flooding that happened around here. So that all changed. Perhaps you can guess what happened. It's the year 1849 to 1850, and there is a huge boom in population. People started streaming here for the gold rush, and the easiest way they got here was by ship. They would arrive by ship into San Francisco, take a smaller boat, and come up through the Delta and come here. The river has been so important for transportation, for everything. So they would arrive here, get off the banks, and a lot of these people weren't really intending to make Sacramento their home, and so they might pitch tents or even build some buildings that were made out of canvas and wood, and would make that their home here. And it was always kind of meant to be temporary, but then more and more people started to arrive, and business owners started to purchase land and build more permanent structures. Well, what happened was in 1850, there was the first kind of experience, now that all these, I think the population in 1850 boomed to 10,000 people, which it had been a few hundred before. And so it flooded, of course, in 1850. So, okay, this is their first sort of experience. It was in January of 1850 that was the first like big flood for people that they first experienced. I want to get my dates right here. But it swept away, all these sort of makeshift tents, all these canvas buildings, and it killed a lot of the livestock around here too. And there's a lot of accounts of just like how disgusting that was. This livestock was, floating in the streets, super unsanitary, really bad for the health and the well-being of the people that lived here. And there's a lot of like first person accounts of just like how bad it really was. So suddenly, okay, the mindset of the people who own land, who own businesses here, is starting to say, oh, this might be something we need to deal with this. We can't just like, deal with a flood every single winter when it starts to rain, and even in the spring when the snows in the Sierras start to melt and sweeps through into the river. So what do? They build a levee. Now where I'm standing is pretty high from where this is, and eventually this levee would get built up even higher to where our museum is, which is about 20 feet above where the original city would have been. And you can kind of see that here, that's way higher than where the actual river is, and that's because it was all built up over time. All right, well, great, awesome, we did a good job, right? We built a levee, so now we're protected. Well, unfortunately, in 1852, it flooded again, and then in 1853, it flooded again. So, it's just, this is a floodplain, and people before this knew that and chose different areas to live into to build their homes. Well, now suddenly, though, there's people who own property and they have made businesses, so they're really invested in this. And this tends to be, really wealthy people, landowners, who say, okay, we need to make this an economically feasible area because this is where we've sunk all our money in, and we're going to continue to make this our money. Some of those people are Sam Brannan, for example, was absolutely tantamount to keeping Sacramento here, as opposed to Sutterville, for example, which is a few miles downriver that way. It's where the Sacramento Zoo is now, and it's on higher ground. It would make a lot of sense, actually, to have a booming city down there where it's above the river. But Sam Brannan owned a lot of land here. So it's not good for Sam Brannan. Yeah. And other people, Hardin Bigelow, for example. So in after these next floods, 1853, there's a lot of activity going on here today. Just ignore that. Hardin Bigelow was one of them who helped build up the levees even further and create longer levees to help with this flooding situation as well. Well, we enter into a period of drought at this point. Perhaps the Sacramentos didn't really realize that. Perhaps their memory was just very short. But for about 10 years, 8 to 10 years here, there's no flooding. From 1853 until 1861, the river doesn't flood. It was actually a drought that was going on. And so they don't really do a whole lot to kind of prevent flooding at the time because that wasn't an issue. And that's a huge time of prosperity for Sacramento. It grew a lot in that time. So let's talk about December 1861. December 8th in particular. Yep, December 8th. The American River, which again was right here. This was the confluence of the Sacramento and American rivers. That's I Street, the I Street Bridge. We talked about the bridges a few weeks ago. That was where the confluence originally was. And December 8th, 1861, the American River rose 20 feet in a day. That's huge. I mean, that's a big problem. So what ended up happening the following day, December 9th, one of the levees gave way. And let me show you where that was. Here we have a little map. It's very windy out today, so I'm going to hold it tight here. So this is the Sacramento River. I'm standing right about here-ish, okay? And then this was the original American River. And where that levee broke is right here where I highlighted it. That's at about 28th and A Street, A like apple. And the levee broke. That was called Rabble's Tannery. curve in the river there, so it kind of makes sense that that would be a weak spot, if you will. Well, what happened was the water was allowed in that one spot, and it flooded like 4/5 of the city. I mean, a huge amount of the city became underwater. But this was early December 1861, and the citizens, I guess, forgot about the earlier flooding, and they kind of treated this like this novel experience that was going on. There's accounts that people were on their little verandas on the second story, and were like waving at each other, you know, like, what, this is crazy. Speaking of, people are using the river for new reasons now. We've got boats and trains and just all sorts of excitement behind us. So they did take it very seriously. In December 23rd, right about Christmas time, more rain, it flooded again. Okay, now it's getting a little bit more serious. Now January 1862 comes around and it just starts raining, and it doesn't stop raining. Let me show you what happened here. It created, so January 9th, about a month after that original one, actually, it turned the Sacramento Valley into a floodplain. It's called a 200-year flood. That scared me. The train horn just went. It's a 200-year flood, and it made the entire Sacramento Valley into this like enormous lake. Let me show you here. I've got a picture. So here's Sacramento. From all the way up here through the Central Valley, we had this sort of inland lake that was caused by this enormous storm that went through. And there's accounts that this storm, you know, went over California and it kept going across the United States. There was a story I read about that when that storm hit Tennessee, it slowed down a lot of truck movements from the Civil War at the time too, from the exact same storm that really just created a lot of havoc here in the Central Valley. So, sorry, it's so windy. So what happened was the levee broke at Rabble's Tannery, and the rivers just rose and rose, and it completely went over the levees and everything. And when the water started to recede, what had happened was they had built up these levees, but the water now had nowhere to escape. And so it created this almost like bathtub type of effect, and it took months and months for the water to actually leave. I have a great picture here too from that time. Let me show you. Of what the city was like. You can see people in their rowboats going down main streets, and here they are on their second stories, just surviving, you know. This was obviously after the rain had already stopped. Yeah, it's pretty intense. So now we know there's a big problem, and I think that any city that kind of lives on a floodplain or lives with rivers at one point has to contend with, gosh, do we keep the city here or do we just move away, right? What if we live somewhere that floods all the time? Is this a place that we should even be trying to live in? And well, again, the sort of motivations that motivated people in the early 1850s continue to be here in the 1860s, only more so, right? That more people own land here, more people have built their lives here. So yes, the city is definitely worth keeping in this one place. So they end up putting a lot of money into it, and they've decided on a three-pronged approach. Perhaps you're familiar with the three-pronged approach Sacramento took in order to keep its city in this area, but with the rivers. So the first one is raise the buildings. If it floods, well, I mean, it'll flood the bottom, right? Okay, raise the buildings. That's great. If you want to know more about it, take one of our underground tours in July. Well, I'm not going to talk about all the went into raising the buildings, but we do on our tours. The second thing was build up these levees. So again, these levees got a lot bigger at that time, and they went for a lot longer as well. And then finally, move the river. Now, the moving the river part was actually led by a gentleman named Andrew R. Jackson. I don't believe any relation to the president. He was a school teacher here originally. He was on I think a city legislature at some point, and he studied the maps and the rivers, and he figured out where the two weak points were. Now, let me show you again that map I originally had. Oh, it's so windy. this right here, where the levee broke originally, that's a big weak point. And the other weak point is the confluence itself, which was right about where we're standing, which was a super busy of activity. It was about 9th Street. And so we said, okay, these are weak points, I guess, as far as flooding goes. So that's what we're going to river. And it's also kind of natural of where the river would maybe easily be moved. So again, if we look at this, this also shows like how they moved it, right? So this was kind of a dramatic curve in the river, and they made it slightly less dramatic there. And then you keep going down the American River, and it makes this sort of S shape originally. Well, they said, okay, we'll just cut across here and make that the river and just get rid of this whole spot here. And that's essentially what they ended up doing. They dug deep channels and ended up diverting the river in those ways. That's a super easy way of saying how that happened, okay? In reality, there was all sorts of problems. So, for example, they ran out of money at one point, and the part that was at the top there by the tannery, this part here, actually went on hiatus, almost fell, for 6 years. For 6 years, they just didn't do anything at that part. And then down here too, when they were cutting across this new one, they did it very straight across into the Sacramento River, and that actually was really bad. It meant that the river was going way too fast into the Sacramento. The American River was flowing way too fast into the Sacramento River, and it caused all sorts of erosion issues, all sorts of new levee issues, because it was just breaking apart the levee that they were building up. I mean, it was not so easy. So for that part, they kind of created a curve in it to slow down the water as it was about to reach the Sacramento River. And then eventually they got more funding and were able to finish off digging the channel up here and finish that. And that's kind of how it happened. By 1868, by December, so pretty much the entire year of 1868, the river was in a new location, in a completely man-made dug location. So the river is finally moved, but there are still some interesting stories that I was trying to read more about, and I'm going to continue to, that where those the parts where the rivers were moved, they sold the land to people because in anticipation of it being moved, and people bought the land. But then they condemned the land because it was still a floodplain, or it was still dangerous in some way, and by condemning it, they actually gave it to the city. That meant that it was owned by the city. So land that they had sold was then given to the city, which if I were a business owner, I'd be probably a little bit upset about that. Now, where the American River meets the Sacramento River now is about a mile north of where we're standing at the Discovery Park. And that part there, if you've ever been there in Sacramento, it does flood. It does flood every single winter, actually. Or, I mean, when we get rain, it does flood every winter. And it was actually built that way. It's meant to flood. So if you happen to be driving on the highway and you see Discovery Park just really underwater and flooded, don't panic. It's meant to do that, because that still is what happens when two river meets. They're going to overflow at some point and flood. So that is okay. Now, I will also say that the dirt that they dug out of the channels, another maybe motivation for the city to own this land, the dirt that they used to dig out that channels was then used to raise up the streets of the Sacramento city. And that's because the city was in charge of raising the streets. The buildings, when they were raised, the buildings were the responsibility of the person who owned the building, but the streets were the cities. So they took that dirt and then used it. Now we get questions about, okay, well, does this still flood? Does this area still flood? And the answer is yes, when we're not in a historic drought. But even as a short time ago as 2019, I took some pictures. So I have some pictures here that are pictures I took that kind of show, again, how interesting it is to work so close to this river and just see on a day-to-day basis the changes. When we first came out here, we were looking for some seals that are often up and down this river. I did want to show you some of the pictures that I actually took here. So you can get an idea. These were taken in February of 2019. So there's the I Street Bridge, and then you can see behind it, or I don't know if you can.
Yeah.
But obviously it flooded. I mean, that water is very, very high. But when I say flooded, the river kind of flooded. The city didn't flood. It didn't breach the levee. Now here, let me show you the next one here. This one. So you can see that wall there is this wall where it says area closed. It comes really high up there. This tree is actually this tree right there.
Here, let me scoot out.
That tree. So I was taking it from higher above. So if I was standing where I was currently standing, I would have been in the water. So that's there. And then the last one, here's just kind of overview too. Those trees are those trees right there. So it reached up to where that tree kind of is. Right there too. So yes, the water, it does, the river still has, you know, a life of its own, and we're still here contending with it, and you know, hopefully as responsible Sacramentans, we respect the river and respect what it can do as well. So thank you.